Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 195th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And as you know, this month's theme focuses on climate change, anxiety and mental well-being. Today, I'm truly honoured to be speaking to Kenyan climate justice colleague Irene Asuwa. Irene co-convenes Ecological Justice League, a collective of diverse community groups reclaiming, rehabilitating and transforming public spaces. She sits at the National Advisory Committee of the Voices for Just Climate Action Alliance and in the technical working group of an implementing consortium. She's a social scientist currently supporting qualitative research on migration, specifically urban displacement and water governance. And this has been an incredibly eye-opening episode. Things that I thought I was aware of, I'm clearly not aware of. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode as much as I did, and also that it will spur you on to take action because things are really, really dire. And it's important that we all have a responsibility to shift things in our own countries and for others. So Irene, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm really honoured to have you joining us from Nairobi at the moment, and you're telling me just now about the temperatures and how it's unseasonably warm, which is really relevant to our conversation. And I wondered if you'd like to share with the listeners what you're working on at the moment.
Thank you so much. At the moment, I co-convene Ecological Justice League, which is a collective of community groups. It's a collective of diverse community groups. So we are working on reclaiming, transforming, and rehabilitating what should be public spaces. At the moment, we are mostly in urban spaces because that's where there's a lot of pressure for green spaces and public spaces where kids can go to play, where people can have their kitchen gardens and communities can have recreational activities. So these public spaces are along riparian areas, so along the rivers or what people would call wetlands, social halls, making schools more green so that children have like more conducive spaces to play and to learn in. So those are some of the public spaces that we are reclaiming and transforming. So the public spaces have a children's corner where children can come to play. They have recreational spaces where communities can hold like their recreational activities and do their meetings. And we are working on having resource centers so that people in the community and specifically children who are still going to school can have access to things like books and computers and stuff like that. So that is what I'm working on at the moment. And also sometimes work as a qualitative researcher. Recently, I was looking at forced migration with a bias on urban displacement, the factors that make people move or have people displaced. And I was also looking at shared water ecosystems, water governance, and how water governance affects service delivery, how it affects how people have access to water, which is also becoming a crisis in the continent and in Kenya at the moment. So those are some of the things that I am working on at the moment.
Thank you, Irene. That's really fascinating. And we know that green spaces in urban areas really do support mental well-being. And thinking about your work as an ecological justice campaigner, what led you to get into this line of work? What was your journey?
So I grew up partly in the countryside, and also my primary school was not in a very urban space. So we had access to all the mud and all the play spaces we could ask for. And also my kindergarten teacher was very environmentally friendly. So we grew trees, we had flower beds, we had all these things. We played, we modeled. So when I came to campus, there was a bit of disconnect. When I started doing community outreach with the school clubs. And so we would go out to economically deprived neighborhoods, and then you'll just see these people crammed in buildings with no public spaces, children in schools that have no ventilation, they have no spaces to play. So after some time of pondering and also working with other organizations on various environmental issues, I felt I would make more impact if I went down to the people and like started this from below, where people reclaim spaces for themselves and lead them by themselves, because I felt that would make it more sustainable. Because if people reclaim a space and make use of it, they would get it, than if somebody else creates a space out of their space for them to come to. It should be more difficult to access. Also, while we were defending spaces outside of where people live, Uhuru Park in the city or City Park or Karura, there is a demographic of people who do not identify with why you should defend those spaces, because they don't have access to them in the first place. They have to have bus fare to get to them. So when you tell them Karura is at risk, it really doesn't make sense to them because they don't have access to it. So while it is important to have these public spaces within the city and also in neighborhoods where most people can't access, it's important for people in poor neighborhoods also to have their own spaces that they can access easily and without using a lot of money.
Thank you, Irene, for explaining that. That is so interesting around people don't see the value. Many people who don't have access to certain spaces don't see the value of keeping them. Of course, that makes complete sense. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your journey. And I wanted to ask you as well, what the term climate crisis means to you. You mentioned about the water and how water in the continent is it's a huge issue, of course. And so the term climate crisis, what does it mean to you?
For me, it's really about the survival of the living species in the planet right now. When the crisis worsens, like I see a lot of irreversible damage that I think most people who are most individuals, because there are not so many people, the individuals who are fueling the climate crisis, I am not really sure if they see that. So that irreversible impact that sees a possibility of just extinction of everything that lives on the surface of the planet. Because the crisis is really impacting on the basic dignity of human beings. If people can't have access to basic things like water and food, and while people don't have access to these things, there is continuity of really compromising, life support ecosystems. So if we're still impacting negatively on water ecosystems that people need for survival, and food systems are becoming more and more commercialized while people die of hunger, it means that the crisis has an impact on our survival as humans and the rest of nature that we are interdependent with and depend on really on the larger part as humans to survive. So for me, it is that serious. I am looking at survival of a species and the possibility of an extinction if the crisis is not solved.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. And yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to ask you about the legacy of occupation and colonialism and how that has fueled, how this has fueled a lot of the climate problems, crises that we see at the moment, and what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so even what we are doing is really a response to colonial legacy, because if you look at our urban spaces, they are colonial monuments. You have people packed in places where their ancestors were packed when the colonialists came here. And so they have lived in these cramped spaces generation after generation. So that's why they don't even understand why there should be a green space, because generations of generations have not had access to green spaces. we still have settlers occupying like huge chunks of land in this country, huge chunks of like arable, the best lands that people could have access of. And we still have every other time indigenous people and pastoralists being kicked out of their land and being told to change their lifestyle and stuff like that, and find other quote unquote sustainable things to do. But if you look at who is occupying this land after they have told pastoralists to leave, they're doing the same thing the pastoralists they're doing. So it's fine if a settler keeps a huge herd of cattle, but it's wrong if a Maasai native in Kenya keeps a herd of cattle. Like, it's like double standards is an understatement. And you look at the efforts also, to, in the name of mitigating and adapting, they still have like this top-down colonial kind of things, because you're telling economically deprived people, don't live next to the river, don't build next to the lake, we need to revamp our rivers and take care of our water systems, but you're not telling the high-end areas with their skyscraper buildings not to build next to the river. So it really doesn't make any sense. So even a lot of solutions that are being prescribed for us still do not have the people at the base or at the center. They're still very hierarchical and a lot of top down without people also being involved. And some of them are false solutions, really. Because you can't tell us to get rid of our indigenous seeds that has been serving us for the whole time. And then you tell us now you have this seed that is resistant and it's the best thing that happened on the face of the earth. But this best seed apparently needs lots of fertilizer, needs lots of pesticides, which costs a lot of money. So in the end, farmers run into debt. In the end, farmers lose their land because they're not able to produce anymore. They have to keep buying seeds and buying fertilizers and buying pesticides. So bringing solutions that make locals to be dependent on corporations are not climate solutions, really. So in our context, the climate crisis is still being fueled by a large extent to colonial legacy. People are being dispossessed of land every day. People are becoming people are having less and less access to food every day. People are having less and less access to water every day. And now we are having an energy crisis. People are not able to afford electricity because it has become more expensive. So the dignity of people is deteriorating more and more. So even the talk of building resilience and all those things do not really make sense to us if people's dignity keeps deteriorating every now and then.
Yeah, Irene, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think it's so important, and I think that yeah, I'm a bit floored by what you said just because it's so powerful, and having a sense of what you said, but not really having a complete picture. And you've filled in a lot of the gaps for me. And I completely agree with you about resilience, because resilience is not a sticking plaster. You can't just say to
Yeah.
someone, you don't have any food, be resilient. It's ridiculous. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that one. And I just feel like, and as you were talking, I was thinking, how do you remain hopeful when there's this legacy of occupation, colonialism, daily pain that you see people going through, people's land being dispossessed, the double standards with, for example, Maasai people and the herds of cows that you mentioned? How do you remain hopeful?
The people really keep me hopeful. I mean, there are a number of days I have woken up and decided I'm not doing this anymore. But when I see like people like wake up and still pick up and go on, it gives me a lot of hope. Also, the enthusiasm of the children also gives me a lot of hope, because they are very enthusiastic about keeping these spaces and designing them and making them more beautiful. So it gives me hope, and the little circle of support systems of people that feel what you are doing is important, because a lot of people also feel like we are just busybodies, not doing anything impactful. So that support system of people who always like give you a pat on the back and let us know that what we are doing is important gives me hope.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. And building on that, I wanted to ask about, in the global north, we're somewhat oblivious. So, like I said, I had a sense of some of the things you said, and I try and keep abreast of these things, and I still really don't know. So, what can and should we be doing in a genuine non-colonialistic missionary charity mindset? What can we do? Because there are things that we can do that we're not doing. So, what are your suggestions for us?
Um, I think the most important one is to just get those countries to stop fueling wars and to stop putting money into their huge military budget that surpasses everything else. So that would be like the most important thing to do. Get the West to stop bombing the world and sponsoring wars all over the place. The second one would be amplifying voices and actions of people in the global south without putting a script to it. Like, don't tell people how you think they should express what is happening in the south. Also, don't depoliticize people's work and make it more diplomatic. Just let them say it as it is. And the third thing is to find mechanisms of supporting technically and financially communities directly, because it is clear that money coming through these big organizations most of the time doesn't get to the ground. And it comes with a lot of bureaucracy and everything that in the end people don't do anything meaningful. So if we find mechanisms of getting technical and financial support more directly to community organizations and people in the community, I think the work would be more impactful. But if we can really get the West to stop bombing people, like that is like the topmost priority for me. And let these settlers live. Seriously, it's been centuries. People need access to their land. It doesn't make sense that 4 generations, 5, 6, some like South Africa, it's probably 10 or more generations later, people still live in townships with no access to their land in their own homeland. It's really painful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Sponsoring wars. Yeah, there's a whole, I'm not an expert on it, but there's a whole other, I'm sure that there are lots of podcasts on that. And I couldn't agree more with you. And when you were talking, I was thinking about truth and reconciliation commissions, and forgive my ignorance, is that something that has happened? Is that something that would work in Kenya for people to get their land back? Or is that gone? Is that moment gone now? And people whose land it is cannot get their land back?
Well, I found that process very problematic and very insulting to the people who had their land occupied and violently dispossessed of their land. And to make matters worse, in most countries where it happened, a good example is Kenya and South Africa, the recommendations have never been implemented. People have never gotten back their land. People still live in shacks and in tiny bits of land in the rural places, especially in the places where the dispossession intensely happened. Others were like taken to other places where they are squatters up to now. So the best thing that settlers can do is just go away and leave their land for the natives, really. Because even the ones that like give the land, give like tiny portions of the land. It's like in a very condescending way. because they say they are donating the land to organizations that do charity. Like, how do you donate land that you dispossess to people? What do you mean? Who did you get the land from? You're donating back the land to organizations, and then when that land is quote unquote donated, it's these so-called charitable organizations that still take them, and then still people don't have access to them because they act as their offices and their whatever they do in those spaces. So TGRC or whatever that thing was called did not work to date. Even people, I think in Kenya, we don't have access to that document. You really have to do a lot of work to get it. So it is that bad, even after all that process of having to face people who massacred your people and beat you up and cut you up. The recommendations have still not been implemented to date.
Okay, yeah. And thank you so much for educating me on that. And I'm also, because I didn't know that. I didn't know that most of the implementations hadn't gone through. And very interesting when you're talking about donating land back. It does feel like missionary benevolence. And like, look how good we are. There's a lot of sort of, it's complete white dominant norms and completely around people making themselves feel good, but retaining their power and privilege, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking also about what we can do as citizens, and you've said, what the global north can do collectively. I'm also thinking about workplaces in the UK and beyond. And there are lots of tokenistic actions that UK workplaces take. But actually, what are the tangible ones workplaces can lead campaigns on to really empower people? And I think some of it will link to the things you mentioned before. But I just wondered, is there anything specific you think UK workplaces could do to support, from your perspective, the climate and ecological justice movement in Kenya?
Well, I think it would make more sense to run anti-war campaigns, like where the money comes from and where like the chief war bandits are. It would make more sense to do that. So I don't know, maybe people there can form like an inter-country anti-war alliance or something. And also these corporations that are really messing up the planet, countries that host these corporations, I think it should make more impact to have campaigns like where those corporations are hosted, to like do public interest litigation or do campaigns, or something like that, on how to really share technical and financial support directly to communities. I am still not sure how I can frame it or how it can be done, to be honest. So those are like the tangible things that can happen, and also like reforms that your respective regimes can do. That is also something that I think can be tangibly done, like things that the president or the parliament in the UK or in those other countries can do and would have like a positive impact on the global south. That's another tangible thing that can happen.
I'm also thinking about, Irene, our pensions. So making sure, this has been a long conversation, pension investments are not going towards the things you were saying, like the seeds, and they are, but to really write and to really put pressure on workplace pension programs so that they're divesting from these negative things that dispossess people's land and focusing more on, yeah,
divestment campaigns can really work. Like get corporations, banks. Oh yeah. Get banks to stop hoarding stolen wealth from here, there.
Yeah, repatriation.
And stop investing in things that harm the planet. How did I forget about banks?
No,
They're like the worst middlemen. They're the worst middlemen in this thing.
Yeah. It just really struck me about pensions, because there's also things that are in South America about investment in tar sands, and Australia, and which impacts on Aboriginal and indigenous communities. So Irene, this work is heavy, and it's obviously this work is part of who you are. It's tied to your values. So how do you look after your own mental well-being? What are your top 3 tips?
So I sleep when I need to. I used to struggle with sleep, but I have learned to sleep when I need to sleep and rest when I need to rest, like take breaks. Like just listening to the body generally. Sleep when I need to sleep, rest or take a break when I need to take a break. And when I get a chance, like just go in somewhere in the wild and rest for a little bit. I'm also very careful of what I eat, but that is becoming more problematic with this food crisis. So it's becoming more and more expensive to eat healthy because we have very limited access to healthy things. Those are like the few things I try and do.
Thank you, Irene. And I really hope that listeners will want to get involved and find out more about what you do. So if that's the case, how should they contact you? How should they make a donation to grassroots charities and do some of the things that you mentioned? And I will, of course, include the link in the show notes.
Yeah, so my name is Irene Asuwa on all platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Gain Rep. People can drop me a message anywhere. And Ecological Justice is also on Twitter and on Facebook, so people can check us out.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for your time, your incredible wisdom, your insights, and just the massive education that I've really had from this conversation. I really, really thank you, Irene.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Oh, it was great. And listeners, take care, and we'll see you in the next episode where we're still talking about this month: mental well-being, climate change, and anxiety. Until then, see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.